Tonight, we drift back in time to explore the challenging world of a prisoner in the Middle Ages. So find your favorite spot now. Let your head sink gently into your pillow and allow your shoulders to finally relax. Take a slow, deep breath in, and as you breathe out, let the day's worries go. Where are you tuning in from? Is it late evening where you are? Or perhaps early morning in your wonderfully busy schedule? Whatever the time, I am so glad you are here. If these stories help you unwind, a simple follow or subscribe ensures we can travel to the past together again very soon. Now that you are settled and safe, let us journey to a time and place where such feelings were a forgotten luxury. The year is 1342. A young apprentice named Thomas has just been thrown into a crowded cell. His crime, a single stolen loaf of bread. He doesn't feel the cold stone through his thin tunic yet. He is too busy scanning the dark room, not for an escape, but for a small patch of floor that is not already taken by shadows. The coarseness of the burlap sack was a familiar feeling against Alaric's calloused hands, but the weight inside was not. This was not his grain. It belonged to the Lord, locked away in the stone-walled storehouse, while the village fields withered under a sky that offered no rain. His mind was a frantic mix of calculations. How many days this sack would feed his wife? How many bowls of thin porridge it would make? The dusty scent of the grain filled his nostrils, a smell that should have meant hope, but now was laced with the sharp tang of fear. He worked the knot on the sack, his fingers clumsy with haste, when a shadow fell across the sliver of light from the door.
The reeve, the Lord's man, stood there, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He did not need to speak. His presence alone was an accusation and a verdict. Behind him, two other men moved with a purpose that made Alaric's stomach clench into a tight, cold knot. They did not ask for an explanation. The open storehouse door and the sack in his hands were the only story they needed. Rough hands seized his arms, spinning him around. One of the men produced a length of rope, and its harsh fibers bit into Alaric's wrists as they were bound tightly behind his back. The half-stolen sack of grain fell to the floor with a soft thud, its precious contents spilling onto the dusty ground like a final, mocking gesture. Being marched from the storehouse and into the village proper was a different kind of punishment. The sharp, uneven stones of the path dug into his bare feet, each step a fresh reminder of his capture. He had walked this path his entire life, but he had never felt so exposed. He saw familiar faces in the doorways of the wattle and daub huts, men he had shared ale with, women who had helped his wife at his child's birth. None met his gaze. Their eyes slid away to study the sky, the ground, anything but the sight of their neighbor being led away like a stray dog. Their silence was heavier than any shout, a collective turning of backs that left him utterly alone in the custody of the reeve's men. The Lord's keep loomed larger with every step, a great block of gray stone that seemed to swallow the light. Alaric had only ever seen it from the fields, a distant symbol of power. Now its cold shadow fell over him, and he had to crane his neck to see the top. The men shoved him through a small iron-banded door in the outer wall, into a courtyard bustling with activity. Men-at-arms sharpened blades, stable hands curried horses, and the sound of a blacksmith's hammer rang out with a steady rhythm. No one paid him any mind. A peasant in bonds was as common a sight as a strayed chicken pecking in the dirt. He was just another piece of the day's business.
This lack of ceremony was its own kind of terror. There was no court, no hearing, no chance to speak of the blighted crop or the hunger that gnawed at his family. Justice was a swift, simple thing. He had been found where he should not be, with what was not his. The reeve muttered something to a guard by another heavy wooden door, who pulled back a thick iron bolt with a protesting screech of metal on metal. The air that washed out from the opening was cool and smelled of damp earth and something else, something stale and unpleasant. One of the men gave him a hard shove from behind, propelling him forward and over the threshold. The world behind him was one of light and sound, of life continuing as it always had. The world in front of him was a steep flight of stone steps, disappearing into a profound blackness. His bare feet found the first step, cold and slick with moisture. The guard behind him gave another push, forcing him to stumble downwards into the gloom. He tried to turn his head to catch one last glimpse of the sky, but the door was already swinging shut. The rectangle of daylight shrank from a bright square to a thin line, and then it was gone, sealed away by the solid thud of the door and the final echoing scrape of the bolt being thrown. He was left in a darkness so complete it felt like a physical weight. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere nearby, and the frantic pounding of his own heart in his ears. He took a breath, and the air he drew in was cold and foul, tasting of mildew and long-forgotten miseries. He reached out a hand, still bound, and his fingers brushed against a wall of rough, sweating stone. There were no more shouts from guards, no more silent stares from villagers, no more concerns about the harvest. There was only the stone, the dark, and the chilling realization that his life had been reduced to this small, black space. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the damp floor, the rough fibers of his tunic soaking up the chill. He thought of his wife, picturing her face as she waited for him to return, a wait that would now stretch into an unknown eternity. The fear that had been a knot in his stomach began to unravel, spreading a cold dread through his entire body. He had acted out of desperation to keep his family from starving, a simple, primal need. But the Lord's justice did not care for need. It cared only for property and order. Alaric closed his eyes, though it made no difference in the absolute absence of light. He wondered if anyone would even know where he had been taken, or if he had simply vanished from the world. He pressed his forehead against his knees, the rough wool of his trousers scratching his skin. The silence of the place was immense, a living thing that seemed to press in on him from all sides. He was no longer a farmer, a husband, or a father. He was a prisoner, a name to be forgotten. Far above him, beyond the stone and soil, the sounds of the castle settling in for the evening would begin, a rhythm of life that was now impossibly distant. Down here, in the cold and the wet, a different kind of existence had just begun, measured not by the sun, but by the slow, steady drip of water in the dark. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a slow, unwilling surrender to the cold. Alaric's first sensation was of stone beneath his cheek, a damp, unyielding surface that seemed to draw the warmth from his very bones. He tried to open his eyes, but it made no difference. The world was an endless, suffocating blackness. There was no hint of light, no crack beneath a door, no distant star. It was a profound darkness, the kind he had only known at the bottom of a well, and it pressed in on him, making each breath feel shallow. A persistent chill crept through his worn tunic, raising small bumps on his arms as he pushed himself into a sitting position. The floor was gritty under his palms, a mixture of dirt and something else, something slimy that clung to his skin. To combat the suffocating emptiness, he began to explore his world with his hands. He shuffled forward on his knees, one hand outstretched until his fingers brushed against a wall of rough-hewn stone. The surface was uneven, slick with a film of moisture that never seemed to dry. He followed it, his knuckles scraping against the jagged edges, mapping the boundaries of his confinement. The cell was small, perhaps only 10 of his own paces from one side to the other. On one wall, his searching fingers found the unforgiving chill of iron bars set into a small opening, too narrow to see through even if there had been light. This was his door, his only link to a world that had forgotten him. Pressing his face against the cold metal, he could smell only mildew and the faint, sour scent of old straw. Time lost all meaning in that place. He drifted between a restless, shivering sleep and a state of weary wakefulness, never sure if moments or hours had passed. The silence was a living thing, broken only by 2 relentless sounds. The first was a steady, rhythmic drip of water somewhere in the darkness nearby, a constant, maddening beat that echoed in the small space. The second was a more unsettling noise, a faint, dry rustling in the thin layer of straw that covered parts of the floor. He knew what it was. He had heard the sound in barns and granaries his whole life. Rats. They were his unseen companions, and the thought made his skin crawl more than the cold. He drew his legs up to his chest, wrapping his arms around them, trying to make himself a smaller target. He was beginning to believe they had left him to die, when a new sound broke the monotony. A heavy, scraping noise came from the base of the iron-barred door, followed by a dull thud. He trawled towards it, his hands finding the rough texture of a wooden bowl. It was warm. The simple heat of it was a shock, a small island of life in the sea of cold stone. He lifted it with trembling fingers, the scent of boiled grain rising to meet him. It was gruel, thin and watery, but it was food. He brought the bowl to his lips and drank, the bland, gritty liquid sliding down his throat. There was no salt, no substance, just the empty taste of boiled oats. It did little to silence the gnawing hunger in his belly, but it was a promise that he was not yet completely forgotten. Once the gruel was gone, a desperate thirst took its place. His tongue felt thick in his mouth, his throat raw and dry. He remembered stumbling over something when he first awoke, and he crawled back to the corner of the cell, his hands searching in the dark. They found the lip of a wooden bucket. He dipped his fingers inside and felt the cool surface of water. Lowering his head, a foul, stagnant odor rose from it, the smell of water that had sat for too long. He hesitated, his body recoiling from the thought of drinking it. Every story from the village elders about sickness and bad water flashed through his mind. But the thirst was a fire in his throat, a more immediate and commanding master than the fear of what might come later. He cupped his hands, dipped them into the bucket, and drank. The water was tepid and tasted of metal and rot, but it was wet. He drank until his thirst was a dull ache instead of a sharp pain. With his immediate needs met, his mind began to race, turning over the same thoughts again and again. He saw his wife's face, her eyes wide with fear as the Reeves men dragged him away. He thought of his children, of the empty grain sack that had led him here. Was it worth it? A few weeks of food for this endless night? He pushed the thoughts away, for they were a pain sharper than hunger. Instead, he tried to focus on the world beyond his cell. By pressing his ear to the stone floor, he could sometimes feel a faint vibration, a deep, muffled thrum of life from the castle above. He imagined the great hall, filled with the Lord's men, the clatter of plates, the warmth of a great fire. The distance between their world and his was only a few dozen feet of stone, but it felt like 1,000 miles. The arrival of the gruel became his only clock. He learned to anticipate the sound of the guards' heavy boots in the corridor, the slide of the panel, the thud of the bowl. It happened once in what he guessed was the morning, and once again in the evening, though the concepts of morning and evening were just memories. He ate slowly, trying to make the meager meal last, savoring the hint of warmth before the cold reclaimed him. The rest of his time was spent in a state of suspended animation. He would trace patterns on the damp floor with his finger, listen to the arguments of the rats in the straw, and count the drips of water falling in the dark. He counted to 1,000, then started again, the numbers a fragile shield against the encroaching madness of utter solitude. He wondered if anyone else was down here. He would sit for long stretches, holding his breath, listening for a cough, a sigh, any sign of another living person. But there was nothing. The silence from the other cells, if there were any, was as complete as his own. The loneliness was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest. In the fields, he had always been surrounded by others, the banter of men during the harvest, the laughter of children in the village, the steady presence of his family in their small cottage. Here, His own breathing was the only human sound, a constant reminder of how utterly and completely alone he was. It was a punishment he had never considered, more profound than chains or beatings. The darkness played tricks on his eyes. After a time, faint shapes began to swim in the blackness, swirls of gray, faint pinpricks of light that vanished when he tried to focus on them. He knew they were not real, but he watched them anyway. They were better than the unblinking void. He started talking to himself, his voice a hoarse whisper in the enclosed space. He would recount the planting of the last season's crops, naming each furrow and row. He would describe the way the sun felt on his back during the harvest. He spoke of these things to keep them real, to remind himself that a world of light and life had once existed, and that he had been a part of it. He lost track of how many bowls of gruel had come and gone. His body ached with a deep, persistent soreness from sleeping on the stone. A thin layer of grime covered his skin, and the straw in his cell was becoming more foul with each passing day. He could feel himself weakening, the gnawing hunger a constant companion that the thin porridge could not banish. He had been a farmer, a man of strength whose hands were calloused from the plow and the scythe. Now, when he ran his fingers over his arms, he could feel the muscle wasting away. This place was not just confining him, it was consuming him, slowly, piece by piece. One day, a different sound echoed from the corridor. Not the familiar tread of the guard, but multiple footsteps and the harsh clang of metal on stone. He heard a gruff voice bark an order, followed by the groan of a heavy door somewhere down the passage. Then another sound, a man's voice, sharp with defiance, shouting a curse. Alaric scrambled to the bars of his own door, pressing his ear against them, straining to listen. He heard the sound of a struggle, a heavy blow, and then the deafening slam of an iron door, followed by the scrape of a bolt being thrown. Then silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of shared presence. He was no longer alone. The knowledge sent a strange mix of fear and relief through him. Who was this newcomer? A thief like him? A murderer? A lord who had fallen from favor? He did not know. He waited, listening to the drip, drip, drip of the water, every muscle tense. He heard a low groan from the next cell, the sound of a body shifting on the stone floor. For the first time in an age, he felt a flicker of something other than despair. It was curiosity, a fragile spark in the overwhelming darkness. The taste of stale water and boiled oats lingered in his mouth as he contemplated all that had just changed in his unchanging world. The rhythm of Alaric's confinement had become a pattern of shallow breaths and the slow ache in his empty stomach. Days were measured by the scrape of the wooden bowl on stone, and nights were simply a continuation of the same unending darkness. The dripping sound had become a companion, each drop a tiny hammer marking the passage of a moment he could not see. He had learned the geography of his world by touch, the four walls of rough-hewn stone, the splintery texture of the door, and the patch of damp straw that served as his bed. His own thoughts had worn smooth, repetitive paths in his mind, circling always back to the pale faces of his wife and child, a memory that was both a comfort and a torment. This established pattern was shattered by a sudden harsh mix of sounds from the corridor. It began with the familiar tramp of the guards' boots, but there were more of them this time, their steps heavier, hurried. A deep voice, not belonging to any jailer he knew, barked an order. This was followed by a different kind of voice, one that did not plead or whine, but bit back with a sharp, defiant edge. Alaric pressed his ear to the cold wood of his door, his heart thumping against his ribs. He heard the rattle of a heavy chain, a grunt of effort, and then the defiant voice again, laced with a curse that echoed against the stone. The sounds were of a struggle, a clash between a will that refused to be easily broken and the brute force of the keep's authority. The struggle ended as abruptly as it began. A loud, final clang of metal striking stone was followed by the groan of rusty hinges on the cell next to his own, a space he had assumed was empty. There was a shove, a curse from a guard, and then the tremendous boom of a heavy door slamming shut, the sound vibrating through the floor and up into Alaric's bones. The guard's footsteps receded down the corridor, their muttering fading, until only the familiar drip, drip, drip of water remained. Yet, the silence that returned was profoundly different. It was no longer the silence of solitude, but the silence of shared presence, a quiet that felt heavier, charged with the energy of the man who now occupied the darkness next to him.
Alaric waited, every muscle tense. He listened for a sound, any sound, from the neighboring cell. A cough, a sigh, the rustle of straw. For a long while, there was nothing but the steady breathing of another human being, a slow, controlled rhythm that spoke of contained anger rather than fear. The sound was a strange comfort, a crack in the wall of his isolation. He thought of speaking, but the words caught in his throat. What could one say to a stranger in this place? The guards might punish him for it. Still, the need for another voice, for any connection to another living soul, was a thirst as powerful as the one for clean water. He finally worked up the courage, his own voice a dry rasp. "Are you all right?" The response, when it came, was not immediate. The breathing in the next cell stopped for a beat, and then the voice, clear and sharp despite the stone walls, cut through the darkness. "I am breathing. That will have to suffice." It was the voice of a man accustomed to being heard, a voice that held its shape and did not crumble into despair. There was no hint of a peasant's accent, no softness of a merchant's tongue. It was hard, clipped, like stones striking against each other. Alaric felt a new kind of caution. This was not a man like himself, not another farmer caught in the Lord's net. This was something else entirely. "My name is Alaric," he offered into the void, feeling foolish as soon as the words left his lips. Names meant little down here. You were simply the occupant of a cell, a body to be fed or forgotten. The man, however, seemed to think differently. There was another pause, longer this time, as if he were considering whether Alaric was worthy of a reply. "They called me Sir Calin," the voice finally answered, and the title hung in the dampness between them, a ghost of a world of sunlight, steel, and horses. Though I imagine the "sir" is a courtesy they no longer feel obliged to extend. A bitter humor edged his words, a joke meant for himself alone. The title explained the defiance Alaric had heard. A knight. He tried to picture the man, remembering the Lord's knights from feast days and market fairs, tall men in polished leather and mail, their faces set and proud. It was hard to imagine one of them here, on a stone floor, stripped of everything that made them who they were. "A knight," Alaric repeated softly, the word tasting strange. What brings a knight to a place like this? He asked the question simply, with the blunt curiosity of a farmer asking about a neighbor's failed crop. He did not understand the intricate rules that governed the lives of men like Calin. Calin let out a short, sharp breath that was almost a laugh. "Honor," he said, and the word sounded hollow in the dungeon. Or what I believed to be honor. I was commanded to lead my men into a trap, a poorly planned charge against a fortified hill, a gesture for the glory of a lord who watched from a safe distance. I refused the order. He shifted in his cell, the rustle of straw the only movement. To my mind, I saved the lives of 50 good men. To my lord, I committed treason. It seems his opinion is the only one that matters. The story was told without emotion, a simple statement of events that had ended his world. Alaric absorbed this, trying to connect it to his own reality. He thought of his own crime, an act born not of honor or treason, but of the simple, desperate growling in his child's belly. The two reasons for their shared fate felt impossibly far apart. My lord's storehouse was full, Alaric found himself saying, the words tumbling out. The harvest failed. The rains came too late, then not at all. My daughter, she was thin. I took a sack of grain. He did not say it with pride or with shame, but as a fact, like saying the sun rises or the river floods. It was what a man did when his family was starving. A long silence stretched between their cells, filled now with the weight of their two different worlds. Alaric could almost feel Calin processing his confession. A knight who fell because of a grand gesture of defiance on a battlefield, and a farmer who fell for a sack of stolen grain. In the world above, they would never have spoken. One would have ridden past the other on a great horse, perhaps without even a glance. Here, in the absolute darkness, they were merely two voices, two breathing bodies, stripped of everything but their stories. Calin spoke again. His tone changed. The hard edge softened by something Alaric could not quite name. It might have been curiosity, or perhaps even a sliver of pity. "One sack of grain," he murmured, not as a judgment, but as a question. "And for that, they throw you in a hole to be forgotten?" He had spoken of honor and betrayal, of grand strategies and the lives of men-at-arms. Alaric's world was smaller, reduced to the fate of a single field and the contents of a single sack. But the consequence was exactly the same. "The reeve said it was an offense against the Lord's property,"
Alaric replied, the official words sounding absurd now. He said it was the law. The law, he thought, was a strange thing. For Kalen, it was a complex web of oaths and duties. For Alaric, it was a simple, brutal wall. You did not cross it, and if you did, you ended up here. He wondered if the knight saw him as a common thief, a man without the honor he held so dear. He was just another mouth that hunger had driven to a desperate act. But Kalen did not sound dismissive. Instead, a new weariness entered his voice. The law, he repeated, drawing out the word. Yes, the law is whatever our Lord says it is on any given morning. In that single bitter statement, the vast social distance between the peasant and the knight seemed to shrink. They had arrived here by different paths, one paved with honor and the other with dirt, but both had discovered that the road ended at the very same gate, locked by the very same hand. In the shared darkness, listening to the breathing of the disgraced knight, Alaric felt a flicker of something new, not hope, but a sense of companionship in his misery, a quiet understanding that even the great could fall.
The tentative rhythm of the dungeon, a pattern of drips and rustles, was broken by a new set of sounds. It was not the familiar tramp of a guard's boots or the slide of their own food bowls against stone. This was different. There were more voices, one of them higher, a woman's, sharp with indignation. The noise came from further down the corridor, followed by the grating of a rusty hinge that sounded less used than their own. Alaric pushed himself up on one elbow, straining to listen. Beside him, in the next cell, he could hear Kalen do the same. The darkness offered no clues, but the sounds painted a picture of an arrival, one that did not follow the usual script of curses and blows. Over the next day, the story came to them in fragments, carried on the careless whispers of the guards as they passed. The new prisoner was a woman named Alara, the wife of a wool merchant from the town. Her crime was not one of hunger or honor, but something that made Alaric's skin prickle with old fears, learned at his grandmother's knee. The guards spoke of soured milk, of strange bundles of herbs found buried by a neighbor's doorstep, of words muttered under a waxing moon. They spoke of witchcraft. This news settled differently in each man's mind. Kalen let out a short, harsh laugh from his cell, a sound of pure disdain for what he called the superstitions of the field and the kitchen. For him, it was a peasant's foolishness, unworthy of a dungeon that should hold warriors and thieves. For Alaric, however, the whispers were not so easily dismissed. He had grown up with such stories, tales of ill-wishing and the evil eye told around the winter fire. He remembered the village woman, Old Meg, who was blamed for a blight on the barley and was forced to flee after her cottage was burned. He had never known if the stories were true, but the fear they inspired was real. To know such a person was now breathing the same stagnant air as him, just a few paces away in the dark, brought a new kind of chill that had nothing to do with the damp stone floor. It felt as if a different, older law had found its way into their prison.
This new prisoner's presence soon created a shift in the dungeon's simple order. of the guards, who treated Alaric with the disinterest one might show a farm animal, began to direct their taunts solely at the disgraced knight. "Hear that, Sir Knight," one would jeer. "They put women in here with more power than you ever had." They seemed to enjoy the irony of a warrior stripped of his sword and shield, now being ranked alongside someone accused of dark magic. To Kalen, this mockery was a constant scraping on an already raw wound, a reminder that in this place his title meant less than nothing. His past glory only made his present humiliation more bitter. Consequently, a new and unseen hierarchy began to form, one that had nothing to do with birthright or past deeds. It was a structure built on the whims of the guards and the perceived nature of one's crime. Alaric, the simple thief, was at the bottom, a creature to be fed and forgotten. Kalen, the failed knight, was a source of amusement. His fall from grace, a cautionary tale the guards could poke at. But Ilara was something else entirely. Her husband's coin, it was whispered, had bought her a small measure of comfort. She was not in one of the dripping cells, but in a drier storeroom, a privilege that set her apart from the common prisoners. The evidence of this privilege was subtle but sharp. Sometimes a different scent would drift down the corridor, something richer than their watery gruel, the faint aroma of baked bread, or even a hint of stewed meat. On those days, the hunger in Alaric's stomach became a twisting, angry knot. He would press his face to the cold bars, trying to catch a clearer scent, the smell of a world he had lost. Kalen would curse quietly in his cell, not just at the food, but at the injustice of it. A merchant's money could buy better treatment than a knight's lifetime of service. It was a galling lesson, proving that honor was a currency with no value in these depths.
This disparity bred a quiet, simmering resentment. The shared misery that had almost formed a bond between the peasant and the knight was now complicated by this new element. They were still trapped, still hungry, but now they were acutely aware that their suffering was not equal. The darkness no longer felt like a shared space. Instead, it was a collection of separate miseries, each with its own weight and texture. Alaric found himself wondering about the woman. He tried to picture her, this merchant's wife, and what kind of charm could be worth the price of a cell next to his. He questioned whether her supposed crime was worse than his own. He had stolen grain to feed his starving family, an act he understood in his bones. Her alleged crime was of a different world, a world of secrets and unseen forces. In the village, a person like that would be shunned, feared. But here, in the Lord's keep, it seemed her husband's wealth could smooth the edges of that fear, turning it into a kind of grudging respect from their captors. It made no sense. The world's rules, which had always seemed as solid as the earth he plowed, were becoming twisted and strange. Kalen, meanwhile, focused his anger on the system itself. He saw Ilara not as a witch, but as a symbol of a world he no longer recognized, where a merchant's purse held more sway than a nobleman's blood. "This is what the world has come to," he muttered one night.
his voice a low growl that carried easily to Alaric's cell. Justice is sold to the highest bidder, and honor is left to rot in the straw. His bitterness was a tangible thing, a cold presence that filled his small space and seeped through the bars into the corridor. Alaric did not reply. He had never known a world where justice wasn't for sale. For a peasant, the Lord's word was the only law that mattered, and that word could be influenced by a gift of a fine pig or a barrel of ale. The idea that a knight might believe otherwise was a strange and foreign concept. He lay back on his thin layer of straw, listening to the drip of water and the distant, muffled movements from the world above. The hierarchy of the dungeon was simply a smaller, harsher version of the one he had always known. The simple fact of a man's purse had reordered their existence as surely as the stone walls that confined them. It decided who got a dry room and who slept on a damp floor, who ate bread and who ate watery gruel. This truth settled over the dungeon, a quiet and unassailable presence. The weight of a few coins had woven itself so completely into their world that it felt more real than any accusation of witchcraft or any claim to a forgotten code of honor. It was the only law that seemed to matter. A fragile rhythm had settled into the darkness, a pattern marked not by sun or moon, but by the shuffling footsteps of the old jailer. His approach was a known quantity, a predictable sound that meant a bowl of gruel or a refill of the water bucket. The prisoners had learned the cadence of his movements, the weary sigh as he bent to the slot in the door. It was a miserable existence, but it was a familiar one. This predictability, however, was shattered by the arrival of a new sound. The hard, deliberate thud of heavy boots on the stone stairs, each step a hammer blow against the quiet. The footsteps stopped first not at Kalen's door nor Elara's, but Alaric's. A new face appeared at the bars, framed by the unsteady light of a torch. The man was broad, with a thick neck and a flat, impassive face that seemed carved from grubby tallow. This new jailer, whose name they would later learn was Morwen, did not speak. He simply stared into Alaric's cell for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over the thin straw and the wooden bucket in the corner. Then, with a sudden, sharp kick, he sent the bucket flying. Water, precious and brackish, sloshed across the filthy floor, soaking a patch of Alaric's straw. A low chuckle echoed in the stone corridor, a sound with no warmth in it. Alaric pressed himself against the back wall, his body tensing, his breath held tight in his chest. He had seen this kind of casual cruelty before in the reeves who managed his lord's lands. It was the power of a man who knew he could not be challenged, a power that found its only joy in the misery of others. He made himself small, a lesson learned over a lifetime of harvests and tithes. From the adjacent cell, however, a voice cut through the damp quiet, sharp and laced with an authority that refused to acknowledge its cage. "You there, jailer," Sir Kalen called out, his tone that of a commander addressing a lazy foot soldier. "That man's water was his ration for the day. You will fetch him more." Kalen could not see the jailer's face, but he could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the sudden focus of the man's attention. He was accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed, a habit of a lifetime that chains and darkness had not yet managed to break. He still carried the ghost of his armor, the memory of his station, and it demanded that such a petty injustice be answered. Morwen moved slowly, bringing his torch to Kalen's bars. The light cast deep shadows across his face, making his eyes seem like dark pits. He peered in at the disgraced knight, a slow smile spreading across his lips. "Sir," he said, drawing the word out with mocking respect, "I see no knight here. I see a prisoner in a cage, no different from the farmer who knows when to hold his tongue." He tapped a thick finger against the iron bars, the sound a dull thud. And prisoners who give orders to their betters discover that their bowls can become very empty very quickly. His threat was not loud, but it carried a weight that filled the small space, a promise of a new kind of suffering. The knight's pride, a stubborn and unyielding thing, would not let him back down. "My family will hear of this," Kalen retorted, his voice strained. "There are rules, even for dungeons. You are a servant of the Lord, not a king in your own right." It was a desperate gambit, an appeal to a system of honor that seemed a world away from these dripping stones. He clung to the idea that his name, his lineage, still held some power, that there was a line of conduct even a brute like Morwen would not dare to cross. It was a profound miscalculation, a failure to understand that down here, the only law that mattered was the one carried by the man with the keys and the torch. Morwen's laughter this time was louder, a harsh, grating sound that seemed to scrape against the walls. "Your family's gold buys you this cell instead of the gallows, nothing more. And my lord," he leaned closer, his breath smelling of sour ale and onions, "cares only that you do not escape. Whether you live fat or starve thin is my concern, not his." As he spoke, he held the torch tantalizingly close to the bars, its heat a fleeting caress on Kalen's face. The flame illuminated the knight's hollow cheeks and the defiant glint in his eyes. Then, just as quickly, Morwen snatched it away, plunging Kalen back into near total darkness, the memory of warmth making the chill feel suddenly more intense. True to his word, Kalen's next meal did not arrive. Alaric heard the wooden bowl slide across the stone to Alara's cell, and he received his own portion of thin gruel. But the slot on Kalen's door remained shut. The silence from the next cell was heavy and unnerving. Alaric ate his meal slowly, the tasteless paste feeling thick in his throat. Every scrape of his spoon seemed to echo Kalen's defiance and Morwen's retribution. Alaric learned a powerful lesson from the knight's outburst. He saw that pride was a luxury, a currency that held no value in this subterranean world. Here, survival was a different game, played by different rules. The strong did not challenge the jailer. They outlasted him. Over the next days, Morwen refined his torments. He would sometimes forget a meal for one prisoner, only to give that portion as an extra to another, a simple act designed to sow discord and suspicion. He would walk down the corridor, humming a cheerful tune, the sound a jarring intrusion into their grim reality. For Kalen, the punishment was consistent. His rations were halved. The meager portion of bread was gone entirely, and the already watery gruel seemed to be thinned even further. The knight's defiant anger slowly gave way to a gnawing hunger that drained the strength from his limbs and the fire from his voice. His protests became weaker, his insults less sharp, until they ceased altogether, replaced by the quiet, rhythmic sound of a stomach twisting in on itself. Alaric, meanwhile, perfected the art of being invisible. He never met Morwen's gaze. He made no sound when the jailer passed. When his water bucket was kicked over a second time, he said nothing, simply waiting until the footsteps receded before cupping his hands to salvage what little remained in the puddles on the floor. He focused on the tiny details of his world, a spider weaving a web in the corner, the precise pattern of dampness on the far wall, the way the sound of the dripping water changed pitch depending on the time of day. He retreated into himself, building a wall of silence between his mind and the cruelty outside his cell. This was a skill the fields had taught him. Endure the blight, endure the drought, endure the frost, and wait for a new season. The prisoners were presented with a stark and unspoken choice. They could follow Kalen's path of resistance, a path of honor that led directly to starvation and weakness. Or they could follow Alaric's path of silent endurance, a path that stripped away pride but offered a better chance of seeing another day. There was no third option. To provoke the jailer was to invite suffering, and to endure was to accept a slow, grinding degradation. The choice was not made in a single moment, but in 100 small decisions every day. Whether to speak, whether to make a noise, whether to hope for better treatment, or simply accept the grim reality of their powerlessness. From her cell, Ilara seemed to find a different path. She did not challenge Morwen, but she did not shrink from him either. When he mocked her with questions about her charms and spells, she would simply begin to murmur a quiet prayer, her voice a low and steady hum. Her faith appeared to be a shield that his taunts could not penetrate. This infuriated Morwen, who could not understand a power he could not control with hunger or fear. Her quiet resilience became a different kind of defiance, one that puzzled Kalen and gave Alaric a strange, fleeting sense of wonder. He wondered if her god could truly hear her from a place so deep and dark. The small, unseen hierarchy that had formed before Morwen's arrival was now completely dismantled. Privilege was no longer about a slightly better cell or a rumor of a wealthy husband. Now, the only hierarchy that mattered was the one Morwen created in the moment. Favor was a temporary thing, granted for his own amusement and withdrawn on a whim. He would occasionally give Kalen a full ration, watching with a smirk as the starving knight devoured it, only to withhold food for the next 2 days. It was a game of breaking spirits, and Morwen was a master of it, using the simple tools of food and water to exert absolute control over their bodies and minds. Alaric thought of his farm, of the way a hawk would toy with a field mouse. There was a similar quality to Morwen's cruelty, a detached, observational pleasure in the suffering of a creature utterly at his mercy. The jailer was not angry. He was merely exercising his power because he could. This realization was more terrifying than any outburst of rage. It meant that their fate was not tied to any logic of punishment or justice, however harsh. It was subject entirely to the daily whims of a man who saw them not as people, but as objects for his diversion. Their very existence was a game to him.
As another period of darkness settled in, the only sounds were the drip of water and the pained, quiet breathing from Kalen's cell. Alaric had made his choice. He would be the dirt beneath the jailer's boot, the stone in the wall, unseen, unheard, and enduring. It was a bitter thing to swallow, a reduction of himself to the most basic instinct for survival. Yet, as he listened to the silence where the night's proud voice used to be, he felt no sense of victory, only a shared, profound emptiness. As Alaric settled onto his damp straw for another attempt at sleep, the distant, muffled clang of the castle blacksmith's hammer served as the only reminder of a world still at work. The days following the jailer's retribution were marked by a profound quiet from the adjacent cell. Morwen's cruelty had succeeded. The night's challenges ceased, replaced by a silence that was somehow heavier than his curses had been. Alaric listened intently, his ears straining against the dripping water and the scuttling of unseen things in the straw. At first he heard nothing, but then, as one day bled into the next, a new sound began to emerge from Kalen's darkness. It was a faint, shallow rasp, the sound of a man for whom each breath was a conscious effort. It was a sound Alaric knew well, a sound he had heard in the village huts during the leanest parts of winter, when the old and the weak began to fade. This rasping breath soon gave way to a dry, persistent cough that echoed weakly off the stone walls. It was not a strong, chest-clearing sound, but a thin, hacking noise that spoke of a body with no strength left to fight. Following the coughs, Alaric could hear a faint rustling, a constant shivering tremor in the straw that went on for hours. He imagined the knight, a man who had once worn heavy armor and commanded others, now curled into a ball, shaking uncontrollably in the damp chill. The pride was gone from the sounds, replaced by the simple animal misery of a body succumbing to fever and starvation. The half rations had done their work faster than any blade could have.
Listening to the night's decline stirred something unwelcome in Alaric. A part of him, the part that had felt the sting of Kalen's initial disdain, thought that this was merely justice. The noble was learning what it meant to be powerless, what it meant to be hungry. Yet the sounds themselves bypassed such thoughts. The ragged breathing and the hopeless shivering were not the sounds of a knight or a peasant. They were the sounds of a dying man. Alaric remembered his own father, shivering with a lung fever after a winter storm had soaked him to the bone. The memory was sharp and painful, a feeling of helplessness that returned to him now in the suffocating dark. He was trapped, but so was the man next to him. and their shared cage made their differences feel suddenly small. This internal struggle gnawed at him more than the hunger. To help was a fool's errand, a risk for a man who offered nothing in return. To do nothing, however, felt like becoming a part of the stone, another cold and indifferent piece of the dungeon. The choice came to a head when the evening meal arrived. The sound of the wooden bowls scraping on the floor was the only moment of the day that held any promise. Alaric received his usual portion, a thin, watery gruel and a small, hard piece of dark bread. He held the bread in his hand, its rough texture a familiar comfort. It was solid, real. It was another day of life held in his palm. But from the next cell, he heard only a weak cough and then silence, as if Kayelen lacked even the strength to reach for his bowl. In that moment, a decision formed. It was not born of logic or hope for reward, but from a simple refusal to let the silence from the next cell become permanent. Alaric knew Morwen would not be on watch for another few hours. The guard who brought the meals was younger, a lad with a nervous energy who never met their gaze. Alaric waited, his heart thumping against his ribs with a force that surprised him. He ate his gruel quickly, leaving the precious bread clutched in his hand. When the young guard came to collect the empty bowls, Alaric was ready at the bars, his hand outstretched. He didn't need to see the boy's face. He could feel his hesitation.
"He is sick," Alaric whispered, his voice a dry croak. He pushed the bread through the bars. "He needs water, clean water, not from the bucket." The bread was a fortune in this place, a currency more valuable than any coin. The young guard paused, his footsteps halting in the corridor. For a long moment, there was no sound but Alaric's own strained breathing. He half expected a blow from a club or a mocking laugh. He was offering his entire worldly wealth, and it could easily be taken for nothing. The guard's fingers brushed his as he took the bread, a fleeting moment of human contact in the oppressive isolation. The guard said nothing, and his footsteps quickly receded down the corridor, leaving Alaric with an empty hand and a stomach churning with fear and a strange sense of release. He retreated to the back of his cell, sinking onto the thin layer of straw, his body trembling slightly from the risk he had taken. He waited, listening. Every distant shout from the castle bailey above, every drip of water seemed unnaturally loud. He questioned his foolishness. He had given away food, perhaps for nothing. The knight would likely die anyway, and Alaric would be hungrier for his trouble. He had traded a certainty, a piece of bread, for a sliver of a chance that a man who was his better would see another sunrise. It felt like the worst bargain he had ever made, yet he could not bring himself to regret it. He had acted not as a farmer or a prisoner, but simply as a man who knew the sound of suffering. After what felt like an eternity, he heard the soft tread of returning footsteps. It was the young guard, moving with a caution that suggested he did not want to be noticed. Alaric held his breath. The footsteps stopped not at his cell, but at Kylan's. There was the faint clink of a metal cup against the bars, followed by the sound of someone drinking greedily, desperately. The sound was raw, filled with a need that went beyond simple thirst.
It was the sound of life clinging on. Alaric heard a low, hoarse whisper from the knight's cell, though he could not make out the words. Then the guard was gone, his duty or his part of the bargain complete. A new kind of silence settled over the dungeon. It was no longer just the absence of noise, but a shared space between two men. A few moments later, a voice came from the other side of the wall, so quiet, Alaric almost missed it. "My thanks," Kylan rasped. The words were weak, stripped of their usual arrogance, carrying only the weight of gratitude. It was a small thing, 2 words whispered in the dark, but it felt like a crack forming in the massive stone walls around them. It was not a promise of escape or a change in their fate, but it was an acknowledgement. For the first time, they were not a knight and a peasant. They were 2 men, allied against the darkness. The small act had shifted something in the deep quiet, a fragile thread now connecting the 2 cells. The daily rhythm of the dungeon, however, continued its slow, grinding pace, indifferent to the brief flicker of humanity that had sparked within its walls. The small act of kindness towards the knight had cost Alaric a portion of his own thin sustenance, but it had bought something else in return, a fragile thread of connection in the unending darkness. The shared misery between the peasant and the disgraced noble had created a silent pact, a recognition that their former lives meant nothing against the cold stone and creeping hunger. Their days fell into a grim rhythm, marked only by the scraping sound of the food slot and the changing tones of the guards' muffled voices from the corridor above. They learned to measure time by the dampness of the walls and the slow, agonizing ache in their empty bellies, a routine that was both a torment and a strange source of stability in a world that had none. This bleak peace was shattered not by the jailer's cruelty, but by a different kind of footstep on the stone stairs. These were not the heavy, booted treads of guards, but the soft, deliberate scuff of leather slippers. 2 men, their forms obscured by the flickering torchlight in the corridor, stopped before Ilara's cell. They did not carry weapons, but one held a wooden board with a piece of parchment, the other a small book bound in dark leather. Their robes were of sober, undyed wool, marking them as men of the church or the law, figures far more intimidating than any guard with a cudgel. Alaric pressed his face against the cold iron of his door, his breath catching in his throat as he watched them. The older guard, Morwen, grunted an order, and the key turned in Ilara's lock with a loud, grating sound that echoed through the dungeon. The merchant's wife was led out, her hands bound before her. She did not struggle, but her head was held high as she was guided down the corridor and into a side chamber Alaric hadn't known existed. The heavy door closed behind them, and the sound was a final, damning thud. After a moment, Kyalan spoke from the adjacent cell, his voice a low rasp. God have mercy on her. Men like that do not seek truth. They seek an answer they have already written down. For Alaric, who had only ever seen such men from a distance during feast day ceremonies, their quiet authority was a new and profound source of fear. From the chamber came the faint murmur of voices, too distant to make out the words clearly, yet the cadence was unmistakable. The interrogator's tones were calm, level, and persistent, a slow, methodical chipping away at a stone. Then, Ilara's voice would rise in response, initially clear and firm, a sound of denial. Alaric and Kyalan fell silent, straining to hear, their own hunger and discomfort forgotten. The entire dungeon seemed to hold its breath, every prisoner listening to the distant drama. The questions seemed to go on for an eternity, a relentless current of inquiry washing over Ilara's protests. Slowly, the texture of the sounds began to change. Ilara's denials grew weaker, her voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. Her pleas became audible now, short, sharp words that carried down the stone passage. "No, I only used it for healing. It was an old prayer, nothing more." The calm, masculine voices from the chamber never wavered, never rose in anger. They simply continued their work, their patience a terrible weapon. Alaric imagined the scene. The two men in their plain robes, their faces impassive, as they methodically unraveled the woman's world with nothing more than spoken words and the threat of what might follow. Then came a different noise, a scraping sound, as if a heavy stool was being dragged across the stone floor. It was followed by a moment of complete silence, a vacuum of sound that was more terrifying than the questioning. Alaric found he was holding his breath, his knuckles white where he gripped the bars of his cell. Kyalan let out a soft curse in the darkness next door. The silence stretched, thin and tight, until it was broken by a single sharp cry of pain from Ilara. It was not a long sound, but it was pure and piercing, a sound of agony that cut through the mildew and damp, leaving a ringing stillness in its wake. After that cry, no more words were heard from the chamber. The prisoners waited in a shared, unspoken dread. The fear was no longer about hunger or the cold. It was about the deliberate, measured process of justice that awaited them. Alaric thought of the sack of grain he had taken. What questions would they ask him? Would they want to know if he had an accomplice? Would they press him until he name another villager, anyone, just to make the questions stop? He felt a cold sweat on his skin, a terror that went deeper than the mere fact of his confinement. He now understood that his guilt or innocence was irrelevant. Some time later, the door to the chamber opened again. The two men in robes emerged, their expressions as placid as when they had arrived. The clerk made a small mark on his parchment. They walked back up the stairs without a backward glance, their soft footsteps fading away, leaving the dungeon to its usual oppressive quiet. They had done their work, and their departure was as calm and orderly as their arrival. Their dispassionate efficiency was more chilling to Kaelin than any of Morwyn's brutish torments, for it spoke of a system that did not need anger to be utterly merciless. The guards did not return Ilara to her cell. The silence from the end of the corridor was absolute. It was as if she had been erased, her existence swallowed whole by the chamber and the questions asked within it. The remaining prisoners were left alone with their thoughts, the echo of her cry now a permanent feature of the dungeon's atmosphere. Kaelin sat with his back against the stone, the memory of battlefields and honorable combat feeling like a child's fantasy. He had faced men with swords and axes, but he had no defense against a man with a pen and a leading question. Alaric curled into a ball on his thin bed of straw, trying to make himself smaller, to disappear into the shadows. He had been arrested for a crime he had committed, a fact that had seemed simple and straightforward. Now, that fact felt like a fragile shield that could be shattered at any moment. He wondered if his own lord would demand such a confession, if his reeve would stand by and watch. He began to see the web of power that extended far beyond the fields he knew, a structure of lord, church, and law that could demand any truth it wished, and had the means to create it. The evening meal arrived. The same watery gruel in the same wooden bowl. But tonight, the taste of boiled oats was mixed with the bitter taste of fear. Alaric ate slowly, his stomach churning. He could not get the sound of Ilara's voice out of his head. First her denial, then her plea, and finally that sharp final cry. He now knew there were worse things in this place than starvation or sickness. There was the quiet, methodical process of being unmade, of having your own story taken from you and replaced by one written on a clerk's parchment. As the last traces of torchlight vanished from the corridor, leaving the dungeon in absolute blackness, the prisoners were left with a new and terrible understanding. Their bodies were caged, but it was their will, their truth, that was truly under siege. With the deep night settling into the stones, Alaric found a grim certainty, not in hope, but in the dreadful patterns of this new existence, where justice was a word spoken by men who never had to listen to the answer. The interrogator's footsteps had long since faded, but a new kind of silence settled in their wake, one colder and more final than before. Ilara's cries had been replaced by a low, constant murmur of prayer from her cell, a sound that seemed to weave itself into the damp stone. It was a rhythm of endurance, not of hope. This quiet, however, was not destined to last. It was shattered days later by a different sound, high-pitched and thin, the sound of a child weeping. The noise began with the familiar scrape of a bolt and the heavy thud of a cell door, followed by a torrent of sobbing that echoed relentlessly down the corridor. It was a sound that belonged in a sunlit yard over a scraped knee, not in this abyss of stone and shadow. For Alaric, the crying was a sharp pain behind the ribs.
It brought back the faces of his own children, their small hands clutching his tunic, and he had to press his face into the musty straw to block out the images. For Kalen, the initial reaction was pure irritation. His world had shrunk to a few square feet of misery, and this new intrusion felt like a violation of the tomb-like peace he had come to accept. But the weeping went on, hour after hour, a raw and ceaseless expression of terror that eventually wore down his anger, leaving behind a weary unease. It was a constant reminder that this place did not distinguish between a knight, a farmer, or a child. The darkness took them all. This persistent sound became the new texture of their existence, fraying nerves already stretched thin. The boy's crime filtered down through the guard's careless talk. He had snatched a meat pie from a baker's stall in the village. A single hot pie, likely taken to quiet a rumbling stomach. Such a small act, yet it had led him to this sunless pit. The weeping only stopped when exhaustion claimed him, and even then, his sleep was broken by hiccuping whimpers and sharp cries as he relived his capture in his dreams. The sound made the watery gruel taste even more like ash in their mouths, and the constant chill of the stone feel more invasive. It was the sound of utter helplessness. One evening, the heavy tread of Morwen the jailer stopped not at the food slot, but directly before Kalen's cell. A torch was thrust near the bars, its light causing Kalen to flinch and shield his eyes. In the flickering orange glow, Morwen's face was a mask of cruel amusement. He held not a bowl of gruel, but a piece of dark bread with a chunk of yellow cheese upon it. The smell, salty, rich, and real, made Kalen's stomach clench with a hunger so fierce it was a physical pain. "The little bird's singing is tiresome, isn't it, my lord?" Morwen sneered, the title a deliberate mockery of Kalen's fallen status. The jailer pushed the bread closer to the bars, just out of reach. "He weeps for a meat pie," Morwen continued, his voice a low, conspiratorial rumble. "But the reeve thinks he's part of a larger gang, young thieves who have been plaguing the market for months." Kalen said nothing, his eyes fixed on the food. He could feel saliva flooding his mouth. The boy is terrified. A word from a man like you, a knight, telling him it would be easier to confess his part, to name the others, and he would sing any song we ask. The offer hung in the space between them, thick with the scent of cheese. Morwen laid out the terms of his game with chilling simplicity. Convince him to talk. Give us names, any names will do. In return, your ration is doubled for a month. Not this swill, he gestured dismissively toward Alaric's cell, but bread like this. Perhaps a strip of salted pork now and then, all for a few words whispered through the stone. The torchlight danced across Kalen's gaunt face, illuminating the war taking place in his eyes. Survival was a primal urge, a beast clawing at his insides, and Morwen was offering to feed it. He knew the boy would be confessing to a lie, condemning himself and perhaps others to the gallows for a crime they did not commit. The jailer left, taking the bread and the light with him, plunging Kalen back into darkness and decision. The boy's quiet sobbing started up again, a miserable punctuation to the knight's thoughts.
A month of real food. It could mean the difference between wasting away from the red cough when it inevitably returned and having the strength to endure it. It could mean walking out of this place one day instead of being carried out. The logic was cold and brutally clear. His life was worth more than that of a nameless street urchin. He was a knight, a man of standing, even if that standing was now buried under layers of disgrace and grime.
Yet, as he sat there in the oppressive dark, another voice spoke within him, one he had not heard for a long time. It was the voice of his younger self, the boy who had stood vigil in a chapel, promising to uphold a code. Protect the weak, defend the innocent. The words felt like a bitter joke in this place. What innocence was there in a dungeon? What weakness was not exploited? The boy had stolen. He was not innocent. And Kylan himself was no longer a knight. He was just a prisoner, as weak and helpless as the child in the next cell. The code belonged to a different world, a world of sunlight and honor that he had lost. Throughout the long, cold night, Kylan wrestled with the ghosts of his past and the gnawing demands of his present. He felt the phantom weight of his armor on his shoulders, the memory of its polished steel, a stark contrast to the filth he now wore. Was there any part of that man left? Or had the dungeon stripped him down to the same desperate animal as everyone else? To condemn the boy would be to admit that his title, his honor, his entire life's purpose had been nothing more than a costume. It was a truth he was not sure he could bear. He thought of his own hunger, a constant, dull ache, and then of the boy's terror, a sharp, piercing cry. When Morwen returned the next day, his question was unspoken, conveyed by a cruel, expectant smirk. Kylan pushed himself up, his bones protesting. He looked past the gaoler, toward the source of the faint weeping. He had made his choice. "I will not," he said, his voice a dry rasp, but it held a firmness that had been absent for weeks. The boy is alone. There is no gang. He did not know if it was true, but in that moment, he willed it to be. He would not trade a child's life for a piece of bread. The smirk vanished from Morwen's face, replaced by a flash of rage. The answer was not what he wanted. There was a jangle of keys, and Kalen's cell door swung open. The jailer's boot caught him in the ribs, sending a shock of fire through his chest and knocking the breath from his lungs. He curled on the floor, gasping, as another kick landed on his back. "Proud, are we?" Morwen spat. "Pride doesn't fill a belly, Sir Knight." The door slammed shut, the bolt shooting home with a deafening clang. Kalan lay on the stone floor, every breath a new wave of pain. His ribs screamed, and the hunger in his stomach was now a raging fire. Yet beneath the agony, something else stirred. It was a feeling he thought he had lost forever, a sliver of his old self. He had made a choice not based on survival,
but on a forgotten principle. It had earned him nothing but a beating and continued starvation. But it was his choice. He had faced a moral test in the depths of hell and had not failed. The authority that held his body felt for a fleeting moment weaker than the code that still lived inside him. The darkness that surrounded Caleb felt both ancient and absolute, but for the first time in a long time, it did not feel empty. The disruption began not with a shout, but with the grating sound of the main dungeon door, a noise that rarely signaled anything good. It was followed by the heavy tread of more boots than usual, and the clanking of chains against the stone floor. Alaric, lying on his thin bed of straw, heard the guards cursing and shoving, their voices sharp with effort. Shouts in a dialect he barely recognized, rough and guttural, echoed down the corridor, followed by the slam of several cell doors in the far section of the dungeon. These were new arrivals, a fresh delivery of misery. Through the guards' grumbling, snippets of information drifted down the dark passage. They were soldiers, captured in a recent skirmish on the northern border, troublesome and sullen. For a day, their presence was marked only by their defiant silence, a stark contrast to the usual despair that settled over new prisoners.
This silence, however, did not last. A few days after their arrival, a new sound joined the dungeon's small symphony of dripping water and rustling vermin. It was a cough coming from one of the cells holding the captured soldiers. At first, it was dry and infrequent, little more than a man clearing his throat. Alaric paid it no mind. Coughs were common in the damp chill of the underground. Caleb, in the next cell, made a gruff comment about weak northern constitutions, unused to the solid stone of a proper keep. The sound was a minor irritation, a small break in the unending monotony. It was a human sound, and for a short while, almost a reassuring one, a reminder that there were others breathing in the darkness alongside them. As days bled into one another, the character of the cough began to change. The dry hacking deepened into something wet and ragged, a sound that seemed to be torn from the very bottom of the man's lungs. Each fit of coughing was longer, more violent, ending in a choked gasp for air. The sound carried a weight to it, a persistence that gnawed at the nerves of everyone who could hear. The guards noticed it too. Their footsteps would hesitate as they passed that particular cell, and the clatter of the food bowl being slid through the slot was quicker, more furtive. The unseen man no longer cursed or spoke. His entire existence, it seemed, had been reduced to this terrible, rhythmic tearing in his chest. A new kind of quiet began to grow around his cell, a perimeter of fear that was more solid than stone walls. From that single point of infection, the sickness began its silent march through the dungeon. Another of the new soldiers began to cough, then a petty thief 2 cells down from Alaric. There was no visible sign of its passage, no foul vapor they could see or avoid. It traveled on the very substance they all shared, the stagnant, recycled air of their confinement.
The fear it produced was entirely different from their fear of the gaoler, Morwen. His cruelty was predictable, a force one could attempt to navigate with silence or submission. This new enemy was invisible, indiscriminate, and tireless. It could not be bribed, it could not be reasoned with, and it could not be fought. The threat of the gaoler's fist seemed a small thing compared to this creeping invasion from within.
Alaric found himself becoming intensely aware of his own body. Every tickle in his throat, once a trivial sensation, now sent a wave of cold dread through his gut. He would swallow repeatedly, trying to judge the feeling, wondering if it was just the dust from the straw or the first stirrings of the illness. At night, he would lie perfectly still, listening to his own breathing, analyzing its depth and clarity. A shiver from the cold stone floor would make him question if it was the beginning of a fever's chill. He held his breath when the guards passed, a pointless, instinctive act, as if he could starve the sickness of the air it needed to find him. The darkness, once a simple fact of his life, now felt like a shroud, hiding an enemy that could be anywhere, even inside his own lungs. In the adjacent cell, Kalen grew quiet. As a knight, his entire life had been spent confronting tangible threats, men with swords, fortifications of wood and stone, the clear and present danger of a cavalry charge. He understood the physics of battle, the geometry of a sword fight. This, however, was a foe with no substance, a siege conducted by whispers of breath. He found himself thinking of old campaign stories, of camps where a flux or fever had claimed more men than any enemy blade. He had always dismissed them as tales for the weak, but now he felt a profound and unnerving helplessness. He was a warrior trapped in a decaying body, with no armor to protect him from an enemy he could not even see to strike. The progression of the sickness was marked by a horrifying new sound. After a particularly violent fit of coughing from one of the afflicted, there was a wet, spattering noise. A moment later, the coppery scent of fresh blood managed to cut through the dungeon's usual smells of mildew and human waste. Alaric's stomach clenched. He had seen this before in the village during a harsh winter years ago. He knew what it meant when a cough brought up blood. It was a sign that the body was being consumed from the inside out. A battle that was almost always lost. The name the villagers gave it was whispered with dread. The red cough. The consumption. The hope that this was a passing ailment, a simple jail fever, evaporated with that single defining scent. Then, one morning, the cell at the far end of the corridor fell completely silent. The terrible, racking cough that had been the constant soundtrack of their lives for over a week was simply gone. Its absence was a shock, a void in the air that was somehow louder and more terrifying than the sound itself. The guards, when they came with the morning gruel, did not stop at that cell. Later, Alaric heard them dragging something heavy down the corridor, the sound muffled and hurried. No one spoke of it. The prisoners remained quiet, and the guards performed their duties with grim efficiency.
Another cough began in a different cell a few days later, and the entire cycle of fear and listening started anew, the memory of the silence driving it deeper into their bones. From Alara's cell, the soft murmur of her prayers became more constant. Before, they were a quiet comfort she kept for herself. Now, her words were spoken with a quiet intensity, a shield of faith against the encroaching sickness. Alaric, who had always viewed prayer as a Sunday obligation, found himself straining to hear the familiar phrases, the words a fragile thread of order in the chaos of coughing and fear. He didn't know if he believed, not really, but the rhythm of her voice was something to hold on to in the darkness. He wondered if her God could hear her from a place like this, a place that felt so utterly abandoned by anything good or holy. Even the cruel jailer, Morwen, seemed affected. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a tense, hurried caution. He no longer lingered by the cells to taunt the prisoners. Instead of his bare face, the prisoners now saw only a strip of cloth tied over his nose and mouth when he brought a torch near. His fear was perhaps the most terrifying confirmation of their danger. He, who had power over their lives, who could bring pain or withhold food at his whim, was afraid. It meant the sickness was a power greater than his own, a force that did not respect the hierarchy of jailer and prisoner. In a strange way, the disease had made them all equal in their vulnerability.
Slow pace. Alaric lay back in his straw, the sounds of suffering from the surrounding cells weaving together into a single, desperate chorus. He thought of his fields, of the way a patch of blight could appear on a few stalks of wheat and, if left unchecked, spread until the entire harvest was a blackened ruin. This was the same. The dungeon was a fallow field, and they were the blighted crop. A strange sense of detachment washed over him, the kind of calm that comes when a struggle is so overwhelming that there is no point in fighting anymore. He could not run. He could not hide. He could only lie there and breathe and wait. He curled onto his side, turning his face to the cold stone wall as if it could offer some protection. A deep chill settled into his bones, a cold that had little to do with the damp air. He pulled the thin, scratchy blanket up to his chin, a gesture that he knew was useless against this particular enemy. In the suffocating blackness of his cell, Alaric carried the inescapable sounds of the spreading sickness into a restless and shallow sleep. The shuffling of boots and the groan of rusty hinges announced her return. Alaric, lying on his thin bed of straw, turned his head toward the sound, every small movement an effort. The guards shoved someone into a nearby cell, the door slamming shut with a final, echoing boom that vibrated through the stone floor and into his bones. There was a soft thud, as of a body slumping against the wall, and then a profound silence fell, deeper than before. The usual noises of the dungeon, the drip of water, the distant rustle of vermin, seemed to hold their breath. The men who had suffered through the red cough had left behind an emptiness, a quiet that was more unnerving than their pained breathing had ever been. This new silence was different, heavy with the memory of what had happened to the merchant's wife, Ilara, in the interrogator's chamber. After what felt like an hour, a new sound began. So faint at first, Alaric wondered if it was merely the blood humming in his ears. It was a low, rhythmic murmur, a thread of sound weaving through the darkness. It was not a cry of pain or a sob of despair, but something else entirely. As he strained to listen, he began to make out the words, spoken in the Latin of the Church, the language of priests and prayers. He recognized them from countless Sundays spent standing in the village chapel, his mind usually wandering to the state of his fields or the clouds in the sky. He had never paid much attention, the words simply a familiar drone that marked the passage of a holy day. But here, in the crushing dark, they were transformed. The quiet, steady chanting became the new rhythm of the dungeon. It rose in the morning, a counterpoint to the scraping of the jailer's bowl. And it continued long after the last sounds from the castle above had faded into the night. For Alaric, the words were a strange and unexpected comfort. They no longer spoke of a distant, demanding God, but of home. He closed his eyes and could almost feel the rough-hewn wood of the church pew beneath his fingers, could almost smell the faint scent of beeswax candles and damp wool from his neighbors' coats. The prayers were a link, a rope thrown back to a world he thought was lost forever. He did not think of salvation or forgiveness. He thought of the sun on his face as he walked to Mass, a piece of bread in his pocket for the journey home. Ilara's faith, forged in some terrible fire he could not imagine, had become his shield against the suffocating silence. In the adjacent cell, Sir Calin heard the same words and felt only a raw, bitter hollowness. His faith had been placed in things he could see and touch: the polished steel of his sword, the weight of his mail, the banner of the Lord he had sworn to serve. He had believed in a world governed by oaths, where a man's word was his bond, and honor was a currency more valuable than gold. That world had crumbled to dust. His Lord had betrayed him. His honor had been stripped away like his armor, and his sword was gone. The prayers Ilara murmured were for a God he no longer recognized, a power that had stood by and watched his life unravel. They were not a comfort. They were a mockery, a reminder that in this place, the only true power belonged to the man with the keys. Calin pressed his forehead against the cold, damp stone of his cell wall, the chill a welcome distraction from the turmoil inside him. He remembered standing in the Lord's chapel, light streaming through the high, colored glass windows, the scent of expensive incense a pleasant sting in his nose. He had prayed then, not with humility, but with the confidence of a man whose station was secure, his purpose clear. He prayed for strength in battle, for the favor of his Lord, for a good marriage and strong sons. It had felt like a negotiation between equals, his service in exchange for divine favor. Now, the thought of praying felt like begging. He wondered if Ilara's God was truly listening in this forgotten hole,
or if her words were just sounds swallowed by the stone, a desperate song sung to an empty room. Her voice never wavered. Day after day, it was the first and last thing they heard. She no longer spoke of innocence or justice, as if such worldly concerns had been burned out of her. Her existence had been reduced to this single, constant act of devotion. Alaric found himself listening for it, his own breathing sometimes falling into its gentle cadence. He remembered the village priest warning of the devil's temptations, of the weakness of the flesh. But he couldn't imagine a temptation worse than this utter hopelessness. Yet, Ilara seemed to have found a foothold in the abyss, a ledge so narrow that only faith could find purchase. He wondered if he could find such a thing himself. But he had no grand prayers, only the fading memory of a field of barley and the feel of his daughter's small hand in his.
Calin, meanwhile, fought a different battle. His pride, the very core of his being, was at war with his despair. To pray now would be to admit defeat, to concede that his own strength, his knightly code, had failed him completely. He listened to Ilara and heard not resilience, but surrender. She had given up the fight for her life and placed her fate in the hands of an unseen power. He was not ready to do that. He would not. He clung to his anger, nurturing it like the last ember of a dying fire. It was all he had left of the man he once was. The whispered Latin from the next cell was like water dripping on that ember, threatening to extinguish it for good. One day, the chanting stopped. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was startling, more oppressive than it had been before. Alaric felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. He waited, listening for any sound, a cough, a sigh, the rustle of straw. Nothing. Calin, too, noticed the absence. He found himself straining to hear the familiar murmur, the sound that had so irritated him, now a missing piece of their grim reality. Had she finally broken, or had something worse happened? The jailer's heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor, stopping not at Ilara's cell, but at Alaric's. The small wooden slot at the bottom of the door slid open. Instead of the usual bowl of gruel, a small, slightly thicker piece of bread was pushed through. It was not much, but it was more than he had received in weeks. Alaric stared at it, confused. Then he heard the jailer speak to another guard, his voice a low grumble. The merchant's husband paid extra, said she asked for it, for the peasant. A moment later, the slot on Calin's door opened, and a similar piece of bread was shoved inside. The guards moved on. The chanting did not resume, but in its place was a different kind of message. It was an act of grace, so unexpected it left both men stunned. Slowly, Alaric picked up the bread. It was still slightly warm. He thought of Ilara in her own darkness, having endured an ordeal that had shattered her, yet choosing to use the small influence she had to offer a crumb of comfort to others.
It was not a grand miracle or a divine intervention. It was something far simpler and more powerful. A moment of human kindness in a place designed to extinguish it. He ate slowly, savoring the taste, feeling a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the food. He wondered if this was what faith truly was, not the recited words or the grand ceremonies, but the simple choice to share a scrap of bread in the deepest dark. For Kalen, the bread was a different kind of revelation. It was not a gift from God, but from a broken woman. It was an act of charity from someone with nothing, offered to him, a knight, who had once had everything. He held the bread in his hand, the rough texture grounding him. His code of honor had always been about grand gestures, protecting the weak on a battlefield, upholding justice in a lord's court. He had never considered the quiet strength it took to endure, to suffer, and to still find the will to help another. Ilara had not surrendered. She was fighting a different kind of battle, with weapons he had never learned to wield. The silence from her cell was no longer empty. It felt full of a strength he could not comprehend. Alaric lay back in his straw, the small meal a warm weight in his stomach. The murmur of prayers did not return that night, but he found he didn't need them. The memory of the bread was enough. He thought of the world outside, of its vastness and its cruelty, but for the first time in a long time, he also remembered its capacity for small, unlooked-for kindness. As he drifted towards a restless sleep, the familiar sounds of the dungeon seemed less menacing. The darkness felt a little less absolute. Alaric curled onto his side, the memory of that simple gift, a fragile shield against the cold. The morning would surely bring the jailer's boots and the return of their grim world. But for now, there was this moment of quiet grace. The rhythm of the dungeon had become a form of timekeeping, a replacement for the sun and moon. There was the scrape of the bowl on stone, the slosh of water into the bucket, the heavy tread of the guards, and the long, deep silences in between. But one day, the rhythm broke. The footsteps that approached were quicker, less deliberate, and the voices that came with them were not the usual grunts and commands. They were sharp, carrying a note of excitement that felt alien in the stone-lined passage. Alaric, lying on his thin straw, lifted his head from the damp floor, every muscle tensed. In the next cell, he heard the faint rustle of Kyalan shifting his position, a silent signal that he too had noticed the change. The guards were not speaking to the prisoners. They were speaking to each other, their voices echoing off the walls and slipping through the gaps in the iron-barred doors. One voice, younger and higher than Morwen's usual growl, was particularly clear. "Took an arrow right through the gorget," the voice said, with a certain grim satisfaction. "They say he never even saw it coming. A clean death for a man who made such a mess of things." There was a lower rumble of agreement. Alaric's mind struggled to grasp the meaning. The gorget was the piece of armor that protected the throat. It was something a lord would wear, someone important. He strained his ears, his own breathing feeling loud in the sudden quiet of his cell. This new information settled over the darkness like a fine dust, changing the texture of everything. The old lord was dead. For a peasant like Alaric, the lord of the keep was a figure as permanent as the seasons, a force of nature that governed the fields, the taxes, and the dispensing of justice. The idea of him being gone was as strange as imagining the sky without a sun. He wondered what it meant. Did it mean anything for a man forgotten in a cell beneath the earth? Kyalan's voice, a dry whisper from the adjacent darkness, answered the unspoken question. "A new lord means a new broom," he rasped, the words devoid of any hope. "He'll want to sweep the castle clean, make his own mark."
Ilara's quiet chanting, which had become a steady, murmuring pulse in the dungeon, had stopped. The absence of her prayers was more jarring than the guard's loud talk. In the silence she left, the full weight of Kyalan's words began to press down. A new master of the keep would have no memory of their crimes, no interest in the details of their supposed transgressions. They were simply remnants of his father's reign, names in a dusty ledger, or perhaps not even that. A surge of something hot and unfamiliar rose in Alaric's chest. It was a dizzying, painful sensation he hadn't felt since the day he was caught with the sack of grain. It was hope. Perhaps a new lord would show mercy. Perhaps he would see a starving farmer and not a thief. This fragile hope was a dangerous thing, a flickering candle in a place that had been utterly dark for so long. It made the heart beat faster, it made the watery gruel seem less foul, and it made the imagination, long dormant, begin to stir. Alaric found himself thinking of the smell of rain on dry earth, of the warmth of his wife's hand, of the simple weight of a tool in his grip. These memories, once a source of constant pain, were now fueled by this new possibility. He could almost feel the rough wood of his cottage door under his fingertips. He wondered if Kyalan, the disgraced knight, was thinking of the heft of a sword or the feel of a warhorse beneath him. Hope gave them back pieces of themselves they thought were lost forever. But as hours melted into one another with no further news, the nature of that hope began to sour. Kyalan's cynical words returned again and again. Sweeping the castle clean could mean many things. A new lord, eager to establish his authority, might begin his rule not with mercy, but with a demonstration of power. A full gallows in the bailey sent a clear message to any who might think to challenge him. The hope that had soared so high now became a new kind of torment, an uncertainty that was sharper and more cruel than the simple, grinding despair that had preceded it. Before, their fate was to rot. Now their fate was unknown, a coin tossed in the air by a man they had never seen.
The prisoners were suspended in this new, terrible quiet. Every sound from the world above became a source of intense speculation. Was that the sound of hammering? Were they building scaffolds? Was the distant cheer from the bailey A celebration for a new, merciful Lord, or for a public execution? They listened to the guards' footsteps, trying to decipher their meaning. Did they walk with the brisk efficiency of men preparing for a release, or the heavy tread of those tasked with leading men to their deaths? The darkness, once a simple fact of their existence, now seemed to be hiding answers, holding its breath alongside them. This state of not knowing was a unique form of suffering, entirely different from the physical hardship they had endured. The gnawing hunger in the belly was a familiar pain, the damp chill in the bones a constant companion. But this new agony was in the mind. It was a frantic race between impossible optimism and crushing fear. Alaric found himself praying, not with the steady faith of Ilara, but with the desperate, bargaining pleas of a cornered animal. He promised a lifetime of faithful service, a lifetime of obedience, in exchange for one more chance to see the open sky. He would accept any judgment, so long as it was not the final one. From Kalen's cell, there was only a tense silence. The night was likely playing out the political possibilities in his head, weighing the allegiances of the new lord against those of his own family. His fate was tied to webs of power and influence that were completely invisible to a farmer like Alaric. It was a reminder of the vast gulf that still separated them, even in this shared misery. Kalen's release might be bought with gold or a promise of fealty. Alaric's only currency was his life, and its value was set by another man's whim. He wondered if this was what it felt like to be a sheep in a pen, listening to the farmer decide which one would go to the market.
Ilara finally began to speak again, but it was not her usual soft chanting. Her voice was thin, a mere thread of sound in the oppressive stillness. She was not praying for deliverance. She was reciting the prayers for the dying. The words, meant to prepare a soul for its final journey, washed over the other prisoners, extinguishing the last embers of their frantic hope. Her voice was calm, filled with a sense of acceptance that felt colder and more final than any executioner's axe. She had weighed the possibilities and chosen to prepare for the worst. Her resignation was a judgment in itself, a verdict on the nature of the justice they could expect. The guards eventually returned, their shift over. They said nothing of the new lord or of what was to come. They simply brought the evening meal, the same thin gruel in the same wooden bowls. The familiar, wretched routine was almost a comfort after the violent swing between hope and terror. Alaric took his bowl, his hands trembling slightly. He ate slowly, forcing down the bland paste, his thoughts no longer on mercy or gallows, but only on the simple, immediate act of survival. The future was a wall of black stone, and there was no sense in trying to see through it. He could hear Kalen eating as well, the scrape of the spoon against wood, a small, defiant sound in the gloom. They were still here, still breathing. Whatever the new lord decided, it had not happened yet.
This single thought became an anchor in the swirling tide of uncertainty. For now, there was the damp straw, the cold stone, and the slow, rhythmic drip of water somewhere down the corridor. There was the darkness and the waiting. This was their world, and for another night, it was the only one they had. The political winds that blew through the halls of the keep far above them were of no consequence to the rats that scurried in the straw, nor to the slow spread of mold upon the walls. These things followed their own ancient patterns, indifferent to the lives of lords or prisoners. The slow, methodical work of decay paid no mind to the changing of the guard, continuing its patient efforts in the deep and forgotten places beneath the castle. The sounds of a world in transition, of a new authority settling into place, were just faint echoes, muffled by 1,000 tons of stone and earth. Down in the silent darkness of the cells, the prisoners were left with nothing but the sound of their own hearts beating, each one a small drum marking a time that no longer belonged to them. Outside the keep's thick walls, the life of the village and the fields carried on, governed by the reliable cycle of daylight and darkness. Inside, however, time had become a waiting game, a long, drawn-out breath held in anticipation of a word that would grant a future or erase one completely. In the deep quiet of the dungeon, the stones themselves seemed to be listening for what would come next. The days that followed the guard's gossip were filled with a new and terrible kind of quiet. The usual muffled sounds from the castle above seemed to hold a different meaning, each distant shout or clang of steel a potential signal of their fate. This waiting gnawed at the prisoners more than the hunger. Hope was a sharp-edged stone in the gut, turning with every rumor that drifted down into their darkness. Alaric found himself listening intently to the changing of the guard, trying to decipher a man's mood from the way his boots scraped on the stone floor. He and Kalen spoke less, each man trapped in his own frantic calculations, their whispered alliance now strained by the suffocating weight of what was to come.
This grinding uncertainty was broken by the sound of unfamiliar footsteps descending the stairs. These were not the heavy, deliberate treads of the jailer, but the quicker, lighter steps of several men. A different quality of light preceded them, not the flickering orange of a single torch, but a steadier, brighter glow. Alaric pressed his face against the cold iron of his door, his knuckles white as he gripped the bars. He saw two guards, their helmets catching the light, flanking a man in a clean, dark robe. This man carried no keys and no cudgel. Instead, he held a rolled piece of parchment, the edges sealed with a dab of wax. He moved with an air of purpose that felt utterly alien in this place of stagnant despair. The man in the robe stopped midway down the corridor, allowing the torchlight to illuminate his parchment. He unrolled it with a soft crackle that seemed deafening in the silence. He did not look at the cells or acknowledge the strained faces peering from the darkness. His voice, when it came, was clear and devoid of any feeling,
simply a tool for conveying information. By the authority of Lord Valerius, new master of this keep, sentences are declared, he announced, his words echoing off the damp stone. He began to read. The first name he called belonged to a man Alaric knew only by his hacking cough, a sheep thief from a neighboring village. There was a gasp, then the sound of guards unlocking a door, a brief struggle, and the noise of a man being dragged away, his pleas dissolving as they ascended the stairs. The clerk's eyes scanned the list, his finger moving down the parchment. A dreadful pause hung in the dungeon, thick with the frantic thumping of Alaric's own heart against his ribs. The clerk cleared his throat and spoke the next name, Sir Calin. From the cell beside him, Alaric heard a sharp intake of breath, followed by the sound of a man rising slowly to his feet. Calin's voice, when he spoke to the darkness, was rough but steady. So it is the gallows, then, a poor end for a knight. He was preparing himself, drawing on the last reserves of the pride that had landed him in this pit. Alaric could picture him standing tall, his shoulders back, ready to meet his end as he had lived his life, with defiance.
The guards approached Calin's cell, the jangle of their keys a grim prelude. But the clerk raised a hand, stopping them. "There will be no gallows for you, Sir Calin," he said, his tone still flat and impartial. "Word was sent to your father. A fee has been paid to the new lord, a handsome sum to secure his goodwill and your freedom." A key turned in the lock, but it was not the sound of a man being led to his death. The heavy door groaned open, spilling torchlight into the knight's cell. Calin stood frozen for a moment, blinking as if the words were in a language he did not understand. Ransom. It was a word of another world, a world of wealth and influence that had no place among the desperate and the forgotten. Freed from his cage, Calin stepped into the corridor. He was thinner, his face pale and shadowed in the torchlight. But as the guards stepped back, some of the old authority seemed to settle on his shoulders once more. He was no longer just another prisoner. He was a nobleman whose life had been purchased. His gaze swept the corridor, and for a brief, fleeting moment, his eyes met Alaric's through the bars. Alaric saw not a comrade, not a fellow sufferer, but a stranger. There was no acknowledgement, no nod of farewell, not even a flicker of pity. In that instant, the shared misery, the whispered words, the fevered nights, all of it evaporated. Calin turned his back and followed the clerk up the stone steps, leaving the darkness behind. He did not look back. Alaric listened as the knight's footsteps faded, mingling with those of the guards and the clerk, until they were gone. Then came the sound he had grown to dread more than any other, the heavy thud of the door at the top of the stairs, followed by the metallic scrape of the great bolt being driven home. It was a sound of absolute finality. The faint square of light was gone. The brief connection to the world above was severed. The fragile community of the damned had been fractured by a pouch of coin, proving that the walls between their cells were nothing compared to the walls that had always existed outside. The hope that had flickered within him fragile as a candle flame, was snuffed out. It was not the fear of the gallows that settled in his bones, but a cold, heavy certainty. He now understood that his crime was not stealing grain. His true crime, the one for which there was no ransom, was being born a peasant. He was not a man to be bargained for. He was a debt to be settled, an entry to be crossed off a list. The thin gruel, the foul water, the cruel jailer, those were merely conditions of his storage. His fate would not be decided by justice, but by simple accounting. The silence that filled the space Kalen had left was profound, a living thing that pressed in from all sides. It was deeper than the simple absence of a voice. It was the silence of utter abandonment. Alaric sank back onto his thin straw pallet, the rough fibers poking his skin. He felt the cold of the stone floor seep into him, a chill that had nothing to do with the dampness of the dungeon. The faint metallic echo of the bolt sliding into place lingered in the air, a final note in a song of despair, as Alaric was left alone with the crushing weight of all that had been taken from him. The silence left by Sir Kalen's departure was heavier than any stone in the castle keep. In the days that followed, the absence of the knight's proud, bitter voice changed the character of the darkness. It was no longer a shared space of misery, but a solitary pit. And Alaric felt its dimensions shrink until they were no larger than the space his own body occupied. The world outside, with its memories of sun and soil, became too painful to recall. Thinking of his wife's face or his children's laughter was like pressing a thumb into a fresh wound, so he stopped. He trained his mind to stay within the damp walls, to focus only on the things he could touch and hear. His universe contracted to the rhythm of his own breathing, the rough texture of the straw beneath him, and the hollow scrape of the wooden bowl slid through the slot in the door. This single sound became the marker of his day, the only event that mattered. He no longer tried to count the passages of time, for the effort yielded nothing but a deeper sense of loss. Instead, he measured his existence from one meager meal to the next. The watery gruel, once a symbol of his humiliation, was now simply sustenance. He learned its every nuance, the way some batches had a smoky taste from a scorched pot, while others were thin and nearly flavorless. He would run his tongue around the empty bowl, gathering every last drop, not from hunger alone, but because the act itself was something to do, a ritual that confirmed he was still alive. His thoughts, once ranging over fields and futures, now circled this simple, repetitive cycle. The scrape of the bowl, the taste of oats, the long wait, and the sound of his own heart beating a slow, tired rhythm in the crushing quiet. It was into this profound stillness that a new sound intruded, one that jolted Alaric from his trance-like state. It was the grating of a key in a lock, followed by the groan of rusty hinges. Elara's door. He pressed his ear against the cold stone of the dividing wall, his breath held tight in his chest. He expected to hear the clipped, demanding tones of the interrogator again, the sharp questions about charms and spirits. But there was none of that. Instead, he heard the calm, almost bored voices of the guards, speaking to her not with accusation, but with a flat sort of finality. One of them said her name,
and then there was a shuffle of feet. Ilara said nothing at all, a silence that was far more unnerving than any of her previous pleas or prayers. The guards led her past his cell, their torchlight painting a fleeting, dancing rectangle of orange on his wall through the gaps in his own door. As they moved down the corridor, their voices became clearer, their words not meant for him, but caught by his sharpened hearing all the same. One guard complained about the damp getting into his joints, while the other worried aloud if they had gathered enough dry wood. "The new lord wants it done proper," the second guard muttered, "a clean fire for a clean start." They spoke of the pyre being built in the castle bailey, the open courtyard within the walls, as if they were discussing the repair of a cartwheel. The casualness of their conversation made Alaric's skin crawl. He heard them ascend the stone steps, the heavy door at the top of the stairs thudding shut, and then the silence returned, deeper and more absolute than before. He waited for her to be brought back. The hours stretched, measured only by the slow, methodical drip of water somewhere in the darkness. The time for the evening meal came and went, but the guards did not return to her cell. Alaric found himself listening for her quiet chanting, the murmured prayers that had become a strange, constant feature of his world. But there was nothing. The space where her voice used to be was now an empty void. He pictured the bailey, a place he had only seen once, crowded with people and animals on a market day. Now, in his mind, he saw it empty, save for a stack of wood and a single post. He did not hear a crowd, nor did he hear a cry. He heard nothing at all, and that was the most terrible sound of all. The absence of Ilara, like the absence of Kalen, reshaped Alaric's reality once more. The dungeon was no longer a holding place, but a final destination. Hope, he realized, was a cruel trick, a flickering candle in a gale. It had made him believe that the new lord might bring change, that justice, however flawed, might still exist. Now he understood. There was no justice here, only power. Kalen had been freed by coin, and Ilara had been condemned by fear. His own crime, stealing a sack of grain, seemed impossibly small and foolish in comparison. It was a peasant's crime, and he would likely receive a peasant's end. The thought did not bring panic or rage, only a profound and weary emptiness. His world now consisted of two states, waiting for the scrape of the bowl and waiting for the grate of the key. He no longer knew which he dreaded more. Each meager portion of food only prolonged the waiting, stretching out a life that had been stripped of all meaning. He began to sleep more, finding in his dreams a brief, colorless escape. He did not dream of home anymore. Even his subconscious seemed to understand that such memories were a form of torture. He dreamed instead of abstract things, of falling through endless dark, of walking down a corridor with no end. He would wake with the taste of stone in his mouth, his limbs stiff with cold, and the silence would be there to greet him, a constant and loyal companion. One day, he heard a new prisoner being thrown into a cell far down the corridor, the man's curses echoing briefly before being cut off by the slam of a door. For a moment, Alaric felt a flicker of something, curiosity perhaps, or a vestige of the bond he had once felt with Kaelin. But it was too much effort to call out, to try and forge a connection that would only be broken by death or ransom. He remained silent, listening to the man's initial rage slowly fade into resigned muttering, and then into the same quiet that consumed them all. The dungeon was an engine that turned men into ghosts, grinding away their names, their histories, and their hopes, until nothing was left but a breathing shell. In these quiet, endless moments, Alaric could almost forget the weight of the life he had lost. His thoughts grew thin and transparent, and the memories of his past faded like ink washed away by a steady rain. He was no longer Alaric the farmer, the husband, the father. He was just a body in a cell, waiting. The fear was gone, replaced by a dull, hollow acceptance. He did not know what would come for him, the rope, or the sickness, or simple starvation. But he knew it would come. And in the great, silent dark of the keep's belly, he found he no longer cared which it was. Outside the keep, the world felt impossibly large. Sir Kaelin sat astride a borrowed horse, the rhythm of its walk a steady, reassuring presence beneath him. He was a thinner man now, his face etched with lines that had not been there before. But he was clean and dressed in wool that did not scratch. With reins were smooth leather in his hands, not the biting rope of a captive. He had been given a skin of water, and its taste was cool and pure, a miracle after the foulness of the bucket in his cell. Each breath he drew did not carry the scent of mold and despair, but of damp earth and distant wood smoke, the smells of a living world. His family's gold had bought him this air, this horse, this future. It was a transaction, simple and cold, yet it felt like a resurrection. He urged the horse into a trot, leaving the gray stone walls behind him. He did not look back. There was nothing there for him but the memory of a farmer's quiet resilience and the echo of a woman's prayers. He wondered, for a moment, what would become of the farmer, Alaric. The thought was a small, sharp stone in his mind, but he pushed it away. The world was as it was, a knight paid in coin, a peasant paid in justice. He had survived his trial, and in time this experience would soften, becoming a story he told by the fire, a testament to his endurance. The clatter of his horse's hooves on the road was the sound of his old life returning. Yet the silence of the dungeon was a sound he knew he would never truly leave behind. As his horse carried him further from the stone walls, another journey was beginning within them. Alaric heard the sound he had been dreading and longing for in equal measure, the grating of iron as the bolt on his cell door was drawn back. 2 guards stood silhouetted against the torchlight in the corridor. No words were spoken. One of them grabbed his arm, the grip impersonal and strong, and pulled him to his feet. His legs, unused to anything more than a few paces, trembled and threatened to fail him. He stumbled as they moved him out of the cell, his bare feet slapping against the cold, damp flagstones of the passageway he had not seen since his first descent. He kept his head down, expecting a blow that never came. They did not lead him toward the interrogation rooms, but toward a narrow flight of stone steps, spiraling upward. With each step, a faint gray light grew stronger, a light he had almost forgotten existed. It was thin and weak at first, but it grew until it was a painful glare. He squeezed his eyes shut as they emerged from the stairwell, the raw brightness of physical assault. The noise was a confusing rush of sounds, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cattle, the distant shouts of men practicing with swords. It was the sound of the world he had lost, and it was overwhelming. The guard's grip tightened, pulling him forward into the castle bailey.
The air felt cool on his face, a sensation so foreign it made him shiver. He slowly, cautiously opened his eyes, blinking against the sharp clarity of it all. Everything was a blur of motion and color. He saw people moving, their faces indistinct. He smelled roasting meat and hay and the sharp tang of manure. His senses, starved for so long, were flooded, and his mind struggled to make sense of the deluge of information. Then his gaze fell upon the ground before him, and he saw a shape he recognized not with his eyes, but with a deeper, colder part of himself. A long, dark line stretched across the packed earth of the bailey, a stark shadow cast by a tall, angular structure. He did not need to look up to know what it was. The shadow of the gallows was enough. It was a simple, solid shape, promising a swift and brutal end to the gnawing uncertainty that had been his companion for so long. For a moment, he felt a strange sense of calm. The waiting was over. He thought of his family, a flash of memory so painful it almost brought him to his knees. The worry on his wife's face, the hungry look in his children's eyes. The stolen sack of grain seemed a lifetime ago, a foolish act by a different man in a different world. He looked at the faces in the small crowd that had begun to gather, their expressions a mix of curiosity and pity, and realized he was just a part of their day's entertainment. While the life of the bailey swirled around the condemned, a quieter kind of accounting took place in a room overlooking the courtyard. Here, a clerk sat at a heavy oak desk, his world circumscribed by stacks of parchment and pots of ink. The only sounds were the gentle whisper of a turning page and the steady, rhythmic scratching of his quill. He was a meticulous man, his task to keep the Lord's records in order. He did not think of the stories behind the names, only of the neatness of the script and the correct application of the Lord's seal. His gaze moved down a list of names under the heading Dungeon Inmates. He dipped his quill into a small pot of black oak gall ink, the mixture created from crushed oak apples and iron salts. The first name he addressed was familiar, Sir Calin of Westfall. Beside it, he carefully wrote the word ransomed and noted the sum received. The transaction was complete.
the ledger balanced. The night's ordeal was now a matter of finance, a successful negotiation for the new Lord's treasury. The clerk blotted the ink with a pinch of fine sand, watching it absorb the excess before brushing it away, leaving a crisp, clean entry. His work was about order, about transforming the chaotic events of the keep into a permanent, understandable record. The next name on the list was Ilara, wife of Merrick the Weaver. The clerk paused, recalling the whispered talk among the castle staff and the smell of smoke that had drifted over the walls days before. It was not his place to question the judgment. His quill moved again, and beside her name he wrote, "Executed for witchcraft." 2 words to summarize the fear, the accusations, the interrogation, and the final, terrible burning. The entry was as clean and emotionless as the one before it. The matter was concluded, her space in the world officially closed. Finally, he came to the last name, Alaric, peasant. No surname was recorded. Beside this entry, he dipped his quill one last time. From his window, he could just see the bailey below and the small crowd gathered near the wooden structure. He heard no sounds through the thick glass, but he knew what was happening. His pen moved with practiced ease, forming the final words of the man's existence. Executed for theft. A simple crime, a simple sentence. The ink dried quickly on the parchment. With his task complete, the clerk reviewed the page. 3 names, 3 fates, all neatly documented. He closed the heavy, leather-bound book, the cover thudding softly in the quiet room. The sounds of the bailey outside were fading as the crowd dispersed, their moment of morbid interest finished. For the clerk, the day's work was nearly done. He tidied his desk, placing the inkpot and quill back in their proper places. The individual struggles, the knight's pride, the woman's faith, the farmer's desperation, were now silent, pressed between pages of parchment. The written word had woven their separate ends into a single, silent record. Their time of suffering had passed, becoming nothing more than a line of ink in a book that few would ever read. Outside, the world moved on, indifferent to the lives that had just been extinguished or irrevocably altered. A knight rode toward his future. A family mourned a father they would never see again. And in the quiet of a scriptorium, a page was turned, ready for the next names to be written down. The system, relentless and impartial, continued its work. As we gently close the book on our journey through the medieval prison, let the distant echoes of that harsh world fade into the quiet of your own. The cold stone floors and the chilling dampness we imagined are now just faint whispers of history, a story that has been told. There are no footsteps of a jailer approaching, only the peaceful stillness of your room. There is no rough-spun tunic or bed of straw, only the soft comfort that holds you now. Allow the weight of those ancient chains to be a reminder of your own freedom, to rest, to drift, and to dream. Let the profound distance of time be your blanket, wrapping you in the safety and peace of this present moment. Sleep well, knowing those doors of the past are firmly closed for the night.